It was just another cold morning after 20 years of service, polishing the silver she would never own, until the old man's lawyer placed a single, sealed envelope into her work-roughened hands. Inside was a last will and testament, and next to her name, a number that represented the entire fortune. The family's furious reaction in the following hour would expose a truth far more valuable than the money. For 2 decades, Ilara had been more than the housekeeper at the Sterling Manor. She was a silent witness to every family secret, every whispered argument, and the only consistent presence for the reclusive billionaire, Alistair Sterling, in his final years. Now, with his fortune hanging in the balance, one explosive question would divide everyone in the room. Was this a reward for unparalleled loyalty or the final act of a manipulated old man? The answer would unfold in the 60 minutes of chaos that followed the reading of that single line. Ilara's story with the Sterling family began not in the opulent main hall, but in the silent, dust-filled library 20 years prior, when a young Alistair Sterling first hired her not for her references, but for her silence. She was a recent immigrant, her English hesitant, her world reduced to a single suitcase. He saw not a servant, but a discreet witness. For 2 decades, she arrived at 5 a.m., left after 10 p.m., and in between she saw everything. She saw the arguments over money that shook the crystal chandeliers. She saw the succession of gold-digging girlfriends and sycophantic friends who vanished the moment his checks stopped clearing. She saw his own children, Marcus, Victoria, and Elena, visit only on holidays, their conversations a transactional checklist of requests masked as concern. The family saw her as part of the furniture, a reliable, invisible fixture. They thanked her with impersonal year-end bonuses, never with a cup of tea at the kitchen table. But Alistair saw her differently. In his final, isolated years, as his children's calls became weekly, then monthly, it was Ilara who sat with him in the sunroom as he faded. She was the one who remembered his wife's favorite hymns and played them softly on the old gramophone. She was the one who noticed when his reading glasses were missing or when the pain behind his eyes grew too sharp. She never asked for anything, and that, according to the legal files that would later flood the court, was the problem. Because in the world of high-stakes inheritance, a caregiver, unwavering kindness is often reclassified as a strategy. Under California law, where the Sterling estate was held, a legal principle known as the rebuttable presumption casts a long shadow. If a paid caregiver is named a beneficiary in a will or trust created during their service, the law doesn't assume gratitude. It presumes undue influence. It presumes fraud. The caregiver must then prove, with clear and convincing evidence, that the inheritance was a free and genuine gift, not the product of manipulation of a vulnerable mind. This law was written for exactly this scenario, a shield for families against predators. But what happens when the family itself were the predators and the caregiver was the shield? The stage for the conflict was set 3 years before Alistair's passing. Diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition, he became increasingly reclusive. His son, Marcus, a venture capitalist perpetually on the brink of his next failed fund, began pressuring him to sign over control of several lucrative real estate holdings. His daughter, Victoria, and socialite obsessed with maintaining her lifestyle submitted exorbitant gift requests to cover her debts. Only Elena, the youngest, showed flickers of genuine care, but she was living abroad, distant and powerless against her siblings' constant campaign. And through it all, Ilara polished, cleaned, and listened. She intercepted the angry calls from creditors. She discreetly disposed of the bottles of scotch Marcus would leave empty in his father's study after another harsh conversation about money. She witnessed the day a furious Victoria denied a $200,000 loan, screamed at her father that he was a selfish old man who would die alone. Ilara had been dusting the grand piano. She didn't look up, but her hands stopped moving. Alistair, standing by the window, had simply gone very still. He said nothing until Victoria's car screeched out of the driveway. Then, in the profound quiet, he spoke to the room, or perhaps to the only other person in it. "Loyalty," he said, his voice like dry paper, "is the only currency that doesn't inflate." A week later, he summoned his longtime attorney, Robert Thorne, to the manor. Thorne was a relic of old money, a man whose family had managed the Sterling's affairs for generations. Their meeting lasted 2 hours behind the closed doors of the oak-paneled study. Ilara brought them a tray of tea and sandwiches. As she set it down, Alastair was speaking, his finger tapping a single line on a document. Irrevocable. I want it crystal clear and completely insulated from their theatrics. Thorne had glanced at Ilara, then back at his client, a deep frown on his face. Alastair, the presumption statute is severe. It will be seen as a provocation. Alastair Sterling had then looked past his lawyer, his weary eyes meeting Ilara's for a brief, unreadable moment before she retreated. Let them see what they want, Robert. I am documenting the truth. What happened in that meeting remained sealed for years. The family noticed no change. Marcus continued his financial siege. Victoria continued her lavish spending, assured of her future share. The pressure accelerated Alastair's decline. In his final 6 months, he was largely confined to his bedroom suite. The children's visits became a morbid rotation, each one a tense performance. They would talk over him about division, about valuations, about who would get the Matisse painting in the drawing room. Ilara would hover, adjusting pillows, administering medication, her presence a silent rebuke to their conversation. Then on a cold Tuesday morning in March, Alastair Sterling passed away in his sleep. Ilara found him. She had brought his breakfast tray, as she had for 700 straight mornings, and known instantly by the profound stillness in the room. Her first call was not to the family, but to Robert Thorne. Her second was to Elena, the only child whose number she had bothered to memorize. The funeral was a masterpiece of hollow pageantry. The siblings, united in public grief, delivered elegant eulogies about their father's legacy. They nodded graciously at Ilara, dressed in her one simple black dress, standing at the very back of the church. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week in Thorne's downtown office. The atmosphere was one of grim expectation. Marcus had already contacted a real estate broker about listing the manor. Victoria had selected an interior designer for her future pied-à-terre. They gathered in Thorne's conference room, the air thick with the scent of old leather and impending wealth. Ilara was there too, invited by a specific clause in the instructions. She sat in a chair by the door, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. The siblings barely acknowledged her. Robert Thorne, his face grave, opened the leather-bound folio and began to read the standard preliminaries. He listed the minor bequests, charitable donations, gifts to longtime staff. Then he reached the core disposition. He cleared his throat. The residue of my estate, including all real property, securities, holdings, and assets, both domestic and international, after the satisfaction of the aforementioned gifts, I hereby devise and bequeath in its entirety. He paused, adjusting his glasses. Marcus leaned forward, a pen poised over a legal pad. Victoria gave a small, composed smile. To my faithful friend and caretaker, Ilara Vasquez, in recognition of her 2 decades of unwavering loyalty, integrity, and the profound kindness she showed me when all others had abandoned their posts. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the vacuum before an explosion. Marcus's pen snapped in his hand. Victoria's smile froze, then cracked into a mask of pure, uncomprehending rage. Elena simply stared, her hand flying to her mouth. All 3 heads swiveled not to Thorne but to the woman by the door. Ilara looked up, meeting their stares. In her eyes was not triumph, but a profound, weary sadness. She had known. She had known since the day Thorne left the study, and had carried the crushing secret for 3 long years. Marcus was the first to find his voice. It was a low, dangerous growl. "This is a joke." Thorne shook his head. "The document is valid, witnessed, and notarized. A parallel trust was established to manage the assets with specific provisions to prevent immediate contest." But Victoria was already standing, her chair screeching backward. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Ilara. You poisoned his mind, you isolated him, you manipulative, greedy witch." The genteel facade was gone, stripped away by a 9-figure shock. The central question from the context was no longer theoretical. It was a war cry. Was this reward or manipulation? In the next 60 seconds, the Sterling family would choose their weapons, and Ilara's quiet life would be forever buried under an avalanche of legal paper and naked hatred. And the first move would come from where she least expected it. The first move came not from Marcus or Victoria, but from the one person Ilara had thought might understand. Elena, the quiet daughter, stood up, her face pale with a betrayal that cut deeper than greed. "You knew," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "All those times I called, asking you how he was. You were sitting on this. You let me believe we were in this together." In that moment, Ilara saw the true cost. It wasn't just the money. It was the obliteration of every fragile human connection formed in that house over 20 years. She had lost the only person who ever saw her as slightly more than the help. Robert Thorne's voice cut through the gathering storm. "This is not the forum for accusations. The document is legal. The trust is structured. Any contest will be long, public, and exceptionally costly." But his warning was fuel on the fire. Marcus finally moved, circling the table like a shark. "Costly for who, Robert? For her?" He jabbed a finger toward Ilara. "She can't afford a week of your retainer. This isn't a will, it's a suicide note you helped him write." The threat was naked. They would bury her in legal fees until she surrendered. Within 48 hours, the machinery of wealth swung into action. Marcus retained the most aggressive probate litigation firm in the state, known for their scorched earth tactics. Their opening salvo was a 90-page petition filed with the court, contesting the will on 3 grounds: undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, and fraud. The heart of their attack was the California rebuttable presumption. The petition stated that Ilara, as a paid caregiver in a fiduciary relationship, was a prohibited transferee. The law presumed her inheritance was fraudulent. The burden of proof was now on her, a woman with less than $10,000 in savings, to prove to a judge that Alastair Sterling, a billionaire with a diagnosed neurological condition, was of perfectly sound mind and free from her influence when he disinherited his own blood. Victoria's role was the media. She gave a tearful, carefully orchestrated interview to Society blog, painting a picture of a vulnerable, confused father and a manipulative outsider who had systematically isolated him from his loving family. "She controlled who saw him, what he ate, what he read," Victoria claimed, dabbing at dry eyes. "She created a reality where we were the villains and she was the saint. It's a classic predatory playbook." The story, rich with the juxtaposition of old money and a humble maid, went viral. Ilara's quiet life was eviscerated. Reporters camped outside her small rented apartment. Her photo was splashed across tabloids with captions like "Maid of Fortune" and "The Heist in the Hallway." Ilara, guided by a stunned but determined Robert Thorne, was forced into a defensive war she never wanted. To rebut the presumption, she needed evidence, not just of Alastair's mental clarity, but of the family's abandonment and her own conduct. Thorne began deposing the household staff: the cook, the gardener, the part-time nurse. Each testified to the same pattern: the children's rare, brief visits, their heated arguments about finances, Ilara's quiet, professional care. But under cross-examination from Marcus's razor-sharp lawyers, that same testimony was twisted. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Henderson, that the defendant was often alone with Mr. Sterling for hours at a time? Did you ever see her discourage him from taking calls from his son?" The narrative of isolation was being constructed, brick by legal brick. The pressure was paralyzing. The trust, while immense in value, had strict provisions preventing any dispersal of funds until the litigation was resolved. Ilara was trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare, the heir to a fortune who couldn't pay her rent. Thorne worked pro bono, but the ancillary costs, court fees, private investigators, expert witnesses, were mounting. Marcus knew it. His strategy was a war of attrition. Then a crack appeared, not in Ilara's defense, but in the family's united front. Elena, plagued by guilt and the ugly public spectacle, contacted Thorne privately. She refused to testify in support of her siblings' petition. "What they're doing to her, it's monstrous," she told him over a secured line. "But my father, leaving us nothing, that doesn't make sense. There has to be something else." This wasn't support for Ilara. It was a desperate search for a reason, a missing piece that would make her father's cruel-seeming act comprehensible. Thorne, sensing an opportunity, revisited the estate files. He was looking for anything: a letter, a memo, a cryptic note that could illuminate Alastair's state of mind beyond the dry legal language of the will. And in a digital subfolder of the trust documents, mislabeled and encrypted with a simple password Alastair had once given him for a different matter, he found it. Not a document, a video file. dated just 2 weeks after the infamous study meeting 3 years prior. The timestamp showed it was recorded late at night. Thorne opened it. On screen, Alastair Sterling sat in his library, dressed in a robe. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharply focused, glaring directly into the camera. "Robert, if you're seeing this, they've contested it," he began, his voice firm. "So let's stop the pretense. This isn't about dementia, and it's not about undue influence. This is a final accounting." He took a slow breath. "I have had my financial auditors compile a report, sealed and attached to this file. It details to the penny every dollar extracted from me or my companies by Marcus and Victoria over the last 10 years. Investments that were never repaid, loans that were gifts by another name. The total exceeds $47 million. They have already received their inheritance. They stole it while I was still breathing." The video was a thunderclap. Alastair wasn't disinheriting them out of confusion or manipulation. He was balancing the books. He detailed specific incidents: Marcus funneling company funds into a failing startup, Victoria using a corporate credit line to finance her divorce settlement. "Ilara," he said, his tone shifting, "asked for nothing. She earned everything by doing what my children never could, showing up. This bequest is not a gift. It is a repayment of a moral debt. And it is my final lesson to them, that money amplifies who you already are. It amplified their greed. Let it now amplify her decency." Thorne had the pivot. The case was no longer just about a caretaker's influence. It was about a father's profound, calculated disappointment and a lifetime of exploitation. This video, if admitted as evidence, could reframe the entire narrative, but legal hurdles remained. Marcus's team would fight ferociously to keep it sealed, arguing it was irrelevant, that it proved his father's paranoia, not his sound mind. Ilara, shown the video in Thorne's office, wept silently. It wasn't the vindication that moved her. It was the profound loneliness in Alastair's confession. He had lived his final years seeing his legacy not as a fortune, but as a test his children had failed. She had been the only one who passed. Armed with this new weapon, Thorne adjusted strategy. He filed a motion to include the auditor's report and the video as evidence of Alastair's true intent and state of mind. The legal battle intensified, moving from procedural skirmishes to a brutal discovery phase. Marcus, now aware of the video's existence through court filings, became desperate. His legal approach turned personal, ugly. He hired a private investigator to dig into every corner of Ilara's life, looking for any leverage, an old debt, a relative with problems, anything to pressure her to settle. The investigator, a man named Corrigan, found nothing scandalous in Ilara's pristine life. But he did find a thread. He traced her immigration history, her modest support of a nephew back in her home country, her single bank account. And in doing so, he stumbled upon a transaction he couldn't immediately explain. 2 years ago, a $15,000 deposit into her account from an entity not listed on any Sterling payroll. It was marked consulting. When Marcus received this report, he saw not a mystery, but a smoking gun. "Consulting," he sneered to his lawyer. "A housekeeper doesn't consult. She was taking money under the table. This proves a hidden financial relationship. This proves fraud." He ordered Corrigan to find the source of that payment, convinced it was a secret kickback or a bribe that would unravel everything. What the investigator would uncover, however, was not a secret from Ilara, but a secret from Alastair Sterling himself. A secret so tightly held that it would not just change the case, but rewrite the history of the Sterling family. And it would lead Corrigan to a boarded-up clinic in another state and a birth certificate that had been sealed for over 40 years. Boarded-up clinic was in a town Alastair Sterling had no known connection to, but the birth certificate Corrigan found there, sealed for 42 years, listed the father as unknown and the mother as Maria Vasquez. It was the name of Ilara's mother, who had died when she was a child, and it listed the infant's name, Alastair Maria Vasquez. A son. Corrigan's blood ran cold. He cross-referenced the date with Alastair Sterling's known whereabouts from that era, buried in old society pages. 42 years ago, a young Alastair had spent a summer at a lakeside resort in that very state, a fact noted in a trivial column about upcoming heirs. The timeline fit perfectly. This wasn't a story about a housekeeper, it was a story about a brother. Corrigan dug deeper, his professional detachment crumbling. He tracked down a retired nurse who had worked at the clinic. Her memory was hazy, but she recalled a well-dressed, terrified young woman named Maria and a man who would arrive in a dark car after visiting hours, paying cash for everything. She said the father was a powerful man from out east, the nurse whispered over the phone. She was scared. She said he promised to provide, but she had to disappear. Maria Vasquez had given birth, taken the money, and vanished back to her home country with her infant son. She had died years later, never having told her son, Alistair Jr., the truth about his father. Marcus, upon receiving Corrigan's preliminary report, didn't see a tragedy. He saw a nuclear option. If Ilara had a brother, a secret, legitimate male heir that changed the inheritance landscape entirely, the will left everything to Ilara. But if this Alistair Vasquez was alive, he could potentially contest the will as a pretermitted heir, a child accidentally omitted. California law had provisions for that. Better yet, Marcus could find this brother, ally with him, and split the estate. He ordered Corrigan to find the son immediately. Meanwhile, in the legal battle, the war over the video evidence reached a crescendo. The judge, after private review, ruled the video and audit report admissible. It was a devastating blow to Marcus and Victoria. The narrative in the media began to pivot, from greedy maid to neglectful children get their due. Public sentiment shifted. But just as Thorne prepared to leverage this victory, Marcus's legal team filed an emergency motion. They argued that new, critical evidence had come to light suggesting the existence of an unknown heir, and requested a temporary freeze on all proceedings until a thorough investigation could be completed. They attached a redacted version of the birth certificate. They did not name the heir, but the implication was enough to throw the entire case into chaos. Ilara was in Thorne's office when the motion landed. She read the words "unknown heir" and felt the ground disappear. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice hollow. Thorne's face was grave. "It means they found something or someone who could have a claim. If your father had another child he didn't know about, that child could challenge the will." Ilara shook her head. "He never spoke of another child. He only had the 3. But a cold dread settled in her stomach. Her own family history was a mystery, her mother tight-lipped about the past. She thought of the $15,000 labeled consulting. She had never understood it. Her mother had died when she was 12, leaving her with an aunt. What if that money wasn't for her? What if it was for someone else? Corrigan, following a trail of faded records and hushed rumors in a small Central American village, found him. Alistair Al Vasquez was a 42-year-old mechanic, a quiet man with Alistair Sterling's unmistakable jawline and penetrating blue eyes. He lived in a modest, tidy house, supporting a wife and 2 young children. He knew his father was an American who had provided some money long ago, but his mother had sworn him to secrecy and never gave a name. He had no desire for wealth or drama. When Corrigan, posing as a genealogist, showed him a photograph of Alistair Sterling, the man simply nodded. "That's him. I've seen that face in the mirror every day of my life." Marcus, now in possession of the heir's location, faced a choice. He could approach Al Vasquez directly, reveal his paternity, and offer a deal. "Join the lawsuit, claim your share, and we split the estate down the middle." It was the logical, ruthless move. But Victoria, whose hatred for Ilara had become pathological, proposed a more vicious play. "We don't bring him in as an ally," she hissed. "We use him as a weapon. We tell him that Ilara knew about him all along. That she conspired with our father to keep him hidden, to steal his birthright. We turn the brother against the sister." It was a lie, but a potent one. Marcus agreed. They dispatched a slick Spanish-speaking associate to the village with a dossier of fabricated documents. Fake letters from Ilara to their father urging him to keep the secret, doctored bank statements showing the $15,000 was hush money she controlled. They painted Ilara as the gatekeeper of the family secret, the manipulator who had robbed Al of his legacy to secure it for herself. The strategy worked. Al Vasquez, a man of simple dignity, felt a betrayal so deep it overrode his natural caution. The associate offered him a team of high-powered lawyers, all expenses paid, to file his own claim against the estate. His goal, to invalidate the will that favored Ilara and have the estate distributed according to intestacy law, which would divide it among all the children, including the newly discovered heir. Al, his trust shattered, agreed. He would come to California. The news hit Thorne and Ilara like a physical blow. Not only was there a secret brother, but he was now actively aligned with Marcus and Victoria, suing her. The case had just multiplied in complexity. Reporters, catching wind of a secret love child, descended into a frenzy. The Sterling family saga was now a telenovela. Ilara, reeling, demanded to meet him. Thorne advised against it, but she was adamant. "He is my brother," she said, the word feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. "If he believes these lies, I must look him in the eye." A tense private meeting was arranged in a neutral conference room. Al Vasquez entered, his posture stiff, his eyes wary. Ilara stood, seeing her father's features reflected in a stranger's face. "I did not know about you," she began, her voice breaking. "I swear on my mother's grave. I only learned of any of this when the lawyers started fighting." Al listened, his expression unreadable. He slid a photocopy of one of the fabricated letters across the table. It was a note, supposedly in Ilara's handwriting, advising Alastair Sterling that the boy in Guatemala must never know. The forgery was crude, but to a man who had just learned his entire life was a lie, it was compelling. "They showed me proof," he said flatly. "They showed me money that went through you." Ilara felt a surge of helpless anger. "The $15,000, I received it as a bonus. I used it to pay for my nephew's surgery. I have the hospital bills. I never knew where it came from." She pushed a folder of her own across the table, her bank records, the medical invoices. Al glanced at them, then back at her face, searching for deceit. The meeting ended in a stalemate, thick with mistrust. That night, alone in her apartment, Ilara did something she hadn't done since she was a girl. She prayed, not for the money, but for clarity, for a way to prove the truth to a brother who didn't want to hear it. And as she prayed, she remembered something. A small, locked wooden box Alastair had given her a year before he died. "Keep this safe for me, Ilara," he'd said. "It's not for the lawyers, it's for you. Open it when everything seems lost." She had tucked it away, overwhelmed by the legal battle, and forgotten. She retrieved the box from the back of her closet. It was carved from rosewood, simple but sturdy. The key was on her keyring, a small, ornate brass one she'd never used. Hands trembling, she opened it. Inside were not stock certificates or deeds, but memories. Photographs of a beautiful young woman, her mother, Maria, smiling with a young Alastair Sterling at a lakeside resort. Dozens of letters in her mother's hand, chronicling a secret summer romance. And at the bottom, a recent, typed letter from Alastair, dated just after the DNA test he had secretly conducted 2 years prior. "My dearest Ilara," it began, "if you are reading this, I have failed to tell you the truth while I lived. The man you knew as your employer was, in fact, your father. I discovered this too late, after a lifetime of regret for abandoning your mother. The money you received was not a bonus, but a first, clumsy attempt to provide for my daughter. The will is my apology to you, and my legacy to my son, your brother, Alastair. I have provided for him separately in a trust, which you will find detailed herein. I tasked Robert Thorne with finding him after my death to deliver his portion with no strings attached. I feared my other children would destroy him if they knew. Forgive an old man's cowardice. Love, your father." Ilara wept, the tears washing away 20 years of loneliness. But amidst the emotional tsunami, a sharp, legal clarity emerged. Her father had provided for Al separately. He was not an omitted heir. He had his own inheritance, waiting. Marcus and Victoria had lied to Al, turning him into a pawn to attack her, while hiding the fact that his father had already gifted him a fortune. She called Robert Thorne immediately. As she read the letter to him over the phone, his reaction was a single, sharp breath. "This changes everything," he said. "We have to get this to your brother, and then we end this." But as Ilara and Thorne planned their next move, Marcus was making one of his own. Convinced that the brothers' lawsuit was his winning card, he decided to force a settlement conference. He would bring Al Vasquez into the room, present a unified front of disinherited children, and break Ilara's will once and for all. He scheduled the meeting for 48 hours later. He had no idea that Ilara now held the one piece of evidence that could unravel his entire scheme, and that the brother he thought was his weapon was about to become his judge. The settlement conference was held in a sterile, windowless room designed to suppress emotion. Marcus and Victoria entered with the confidence of generals, flanked by Al Vasquez, who wore a new, ill-fitting suit and a face of stoic resentment. Ilara and Robert Thorne sat opposite them. The air was thick with unsaid accusations. Marcus opened with a rehearsed speech about family, legacy, and the moral duty to correct their father's lapse in judgment. He presented a proposed settlement. Ilara would receive a lump sum of $5 million, a pittance compared to the estate, and sign over all other assets to be divided equally among the 4 siblings, including Al. "It's more than you've ever dreamed of," Marcus said, not looking at her. "Take it, and we all walk away." Ilara didn't look at Marcus. She looked at her brother. "Al," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "before you agree to anything, there is something you need to see." She nodded to Thorne, who slid a copy of the rosewood box letter across the table, along with the photographs of their parents. "Our father left you a letter, and he left you more than a share of a lawsuit. He left you your own legacy." Al Vasquez stared at the photograph of his young mother, her arm linked with Alastair Sterling, both smiling at a future that never came. His stern expression faltered. He picked up his father's letter and began to read. The room watched as his journey played out on his face, confusion, dawning comprehension, then a raw, shuddering grief. He finished reading and sat motionless for a long moment. Then he lifted his gaze, not to Ilara, but to Marcus. "You told me she hid me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You told me she stole from me. This letter says my father set up a trust for me. Where is it?" Marcus paled. "That document is a forgery, concocted by her lawyer." "It is not a forgery," Thorne interjected, placing a notarized copy of the trust agreement on the table. "It was executed concurrently with the will. It establishes a $10 million trust for Alastair Maria Vasquez, with me as the trustee. The funds were never part of the main estate. They were always yours, Al, separate and protected. Your siblings' lawsuit against the main estate has nothing to do with your inheritance. They simply didn't tell you it existed." The betrayal that flashed across Al's face was volcanic. He had been used. He stood up slowly, the chair scraping behind him. He looked at Marcus with a contempt so pure it silenced the room. "You found me," he said. "You saw a working man with simple dreams, and you saw a tool. You filled my head with poison about my own sister to make me fight your battle for you." He turned to Ilara, his eyes brimming. "I am sorry. I should have listened to you." With that, he walked out of the conference room, leaving Marcus and Victoria exposed. Their strategy lay in ruins. Their key witness had just become a hostile one. Thorne seized the moment. Given this demonstration of bad faith and the attempted subornation of a beneficiary through fraud, we will be moving for summary judgment on the undue influence claim. We will also be filing a malicious prosecution suit against you, Marcus and Victoria, personally, for your conduct in this matter. The video, the audit report, and now this, I doubt any judge will look kindly on your case. The legal fortress Marcus had built began to crumble from within. Over the next weeks, faced with the overwhelming evidence of their own misconduct and the devastating personal testimony now promised by Al Vasquez, their legal team advised them to settle. The fight went out of them. The prospect of a public trial, where every financial sin and heartless recording would be aired, was a social and professional death sentence. A final settlement was reached, in strict confidentiality. Its broad outlines, however, became clear through subsequent actions. Ilara retained the vast majority of the Sterling estate, as her father intended. She fulfilled his wishes by formally releasing the $10 million trust to her brother, Al, who returned home to his family, his life transformed, but his character intact. Marcus and Victoria received a small, fixed annuity, enough to prevent destitution, but not enough to fund their former lifestyles. More importantly, they were forced to sign non-disparagement agreements. The public story became one of a private, amicable resolution. But Ilara's story was just beginning. The woman who had lived in the shadows for 20 years now stood in the light of a colossal fortune and a hollow victory. She moved into the Sterling Manor, not as staff, but as owner. The first thing she did was convert the sprawling East Wing into a foundation headquarters, named the Maria and Alastair Sterling Foundation, dedicated to providing legal aid and housing for domestic workers and immigrants facing exploitation. She hired Robert Thorne to run it. The final surprising detail emerged a year later, during the Foundation's inaugural gala. The guest of honor was Elena Sterling. In the quiet aftermath of the settlement, Ilara had reached out. She had not forgotten Elena's early kindness or her eventual refusal to join the lawsuit. Using a discretionary clause in the trust, Ilara created a separate fund to finance Elena's long-dreamed-of art conservation studio, no strings attached. You were never like them, Ilara told her. You deserved a chance to be nothing like them at all. The media, expecting a rags-to-riches villain or a reclusive heiress, was instead presented with a thoughtful, private philanthropist. The narrative completed its journey, from greedy maid to wronged daughter to a woman of profound, quiet integrity. On a cool evening, Ilara stood in the manor's library, the very room where her father had recorded his damning video. She held a single photograph, the one from the rosewood box of her young parents. The polished silver and the dusty books gleamed around her. The house was finally truly a home. The legal war was over. The family conflict had burned itself out. But the lesson remained, echoing her father's words, "Money amplifies who you already are." It had amplified her siblings' greed into self-destruction. It had amplified her brother's dignity into security. And for Ilara Vasquez, it amplified a lifetime of silent service into a legacy of resonant grace. She had not just inherited an estate, she had inherited the power to redefine what the sterling name would mean for generations to come. And as she looked out over the gardens she once tended, she knew exactly where to begin. The story of Ilara Vasquez and the sterling fortune asks a question that echoes far beyond the walls of any manor. What is the true price of loyalty, and who, in the end, is really worthy of an inheritance? We often frame these battles in legal terms: undue influence, testamentary capacity, the rebuttable presumption. But at their core, they are stories about human value. They ask us to weigh the quiet, daily devotion of a caregiver against the loud, genetic claim of family. To decide whether years of service can ever equal a bloodline. Alistair Sterling's final act was not just a transfer of wealth, it was a moral audit. He used his will as a ledger, finally settling accounts not in dollars, but in character. His children had failed that audit long before he died, their withdrawals of love and respect exceeding any possible deposit. Ilara, by simply showing up as her authentic, compassionate self, accrued a balance she never thought to claim. In the harsh courtroom, her life was put on trial as a potential scheme. But in the quieter court of a dying man's conscience, her integrity was the only evidence that mattered. This phenomenon of the domestic worker inheriting the estate touches a deep nerve because it challenges our most ingrained hierarchies. It suggests that the person we often render invisible, whose labor we take for granted in our homes, might see us more clearly than anyone else. They witness our unguarded moments, our petty cruelties, our secret kindnesses, and sometimes, in a final reckoning, that witness becomes the most credible character reference of all. The legal presumption against caregivers exists for a vital reason: to protect the vulnerable from predators. Yet Ilara's story reminds us that the vulnerable can also be the wealthy, isolated by their money, and the predators can be the well-dressed children circling the inheritance. The law provides the framework, but it cannot always discern the heart. That task falls to the evidence, to the letters, the videos, the receipts of a life lived one honest day at a time. For Ilara, the greatest inheritance was not the money, but the truth of her parentage, the truth of her brother, the truth of her father's regret and love. The fortune simply gave her the power to act on that truth, to heal what was broken and build something new. She transformed a monument to lonely wealth into an engine for communal good, rewriting a legacy of exclusion into one of inclusion. So the next time you hear a story about a surprising will, a disputed fortune, a maid named as an heir, look past the sensational headline. Look for the quiet history. Look for the accumulated gestures of care or the long record of neglect. For in those details lies the real drama, not of law, but of the human spirit being weighed, measured, and ultimately revealed. If this story of hidden truths and ultimate justice resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. For more documentaries that explore the profound dramas hidden in everyday life, subscribe and click the bell icon. Your support helps us bring more of these powerful stories to light. Until next time.